right. Well, good morning and thank you. Welcome to the Montgomery Summit and the latest panel. I hope you've been enjoying the event so far. My name is Keith Strier. I'm Vice President of Worldwide AI Initiatives at NVIDIA, and I'm also very involved in our global government portfolio and partnerships across the world. And because of that, I've been asked to moderate this panel today, and we've got some fantastic panelists to join us from just great companies and organizations who are very involved in both the U.S. government, but as well as just the broader conversation of the sort of the geopolitical and sort of policy landscape around AI infrastructure, AI chips, AI software, AI services. So this is just a really good discussion opportunity, and it's a great time to be having this conversation because of the recent release of the National Security Commission on AI report, which is a 700 plus page report, but touches on many relevant, timely topics that we can talk about today and other things. In fact, Stanford released their AI index yesterday as well, which also was which is a great report, very insightful, and touches on a lot of topics we might want to talk about today. So I'm really privileged to be here, a privilege to be with these esteemed panelists. We have Andrew from IBM and Maryam from the Semiconductor Industry Association and Melissa from Deloitte, and I know that we're just going to run out of time when it comes to the topics we want to cover today. So, with the stage set, let's jump right in and have our conversation for the day. I'm looking forward to it. So again, there's so much to talk about, but we have limited time, so we'll pick our battles. I think some of the bigger topics that are on the minds of both industry professionals, users, and policymakers include some of the recommendations and issues raised by the recent report released from the National Security Commission, and those include just the urgency to invest in our supply chain and to strengthen that supply chain to ensure that we have domestic fabrication capabilities and other dimensions to the supply chain that allow us to do the things we need to do to grow our economy, to serve our national interest, and to be good partners as well internationally, frankly. So I think that's a great topic, and that gets to the heart of the growth potential of the industry. So I think there's a lot going on in Washington and across the country and on the public sector side in terms of not just talking about AI, but implementing and adopting AI at scale within government agencies and ministries, and ministries around the world, of course, agencies within the U.S., and the opportunity to use AI as a lever for public innovation and to advance the public mission. And that sounds great, but actually doing that requires a lot of expertise, a lot of capabilities, and a lot of collaboration between the public and the private sector. And this includes the role of systems integrators like a Deloitte and IBM as well. And so we have a lot to talk about there as well. So with that, why don't we start the conversation with the panelists? I'm going to first ask Maryam to help sort of talk about the current state of our sort of our supply chain conversation. And particularly, there's legislation pending in Congress right now, and there's obviously new recommendations out there in the world, and a lot to talk about. And I actually just want one funny anecdote. I usually, we all read about, there's announcements all the time about new plants being built and new manufacturing capacity. And usually when I read that, and I don't get that excited. I'm sure if you live in that town, that's a good thing. But in general, those headlines don't get me that excited. But now that I'm in this industry and excited to be at NVIDIA, when I read this morning that the fabrication plant that's being planned to be built in North Phoenix to significantly boost our domestic capabilities, maybe 3 times bigger than anticipated. I think it was originally planned to be about $12 billion. Now they're talking about potentially a $35 billion facility, essentially 6 different plants on over 1,000 acres in North Phoenix. That got me really excited, and I thought to myself, "Wow, I've really gone native into this industry when I can get really excited about a fabrication plant." That's serious geekdom right there. So, Maryam, you really live in this world. This is you are one of the drivers of our national policy on this. I'd love to hand the mantle to you and ask you to kind of give everyone a taste of what's going on.
Thank you, Keith. I think maybe we can back up a little bit and just highlight for folks what prompted this National Security Commission on AI report. There's been bipartisan interest about the US's technological leadership in AI for going on 3 years now. And about 2 years ago, Congresswoman Stefanik from New York and Chuck Schumer both made a bipartisan push to establish this new National Security Commission on AI. And they've been working on this report for nearly 2 years. They released an interim report as well. What was really interesting about their approach that I thought was really relevant to where we are today in the US on AI is they focused very closely on how the hardware ecosystem around AI and the workforce ecosystem around AI in the US is quite frankly lacking, and what the US government needs to do to make up for that. In the last defense authorization, which is one of the bills in Washington that passes every year like clockwork, there were a whole host of pieces of legislation that addressed AI policy. The National AI Initiative, which for the first time established a need to have hardware semiconductor specific research across the federal government to boost our AI leadership, was included in the bill. And then very importantly for the semiconductor industry, which is a big driver for AI innovation, was the Chips for America Act, which called for a whole host of federal government incentives to both manufacture here and also do more leading edge R&D here. And so the thinking there is by boosting the semiconductor industry, we'll have a much more robust AI ecosystem within the United States. And so I commend the AI National Security on AI Commission for the hard work. The commissioners put a lot of hard work into this report, and now it's heading up to Congress for consideration. And I anticipate that the next defense authorization, there's going to be a real effort to try to implement some of the recommendations of the commission. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Keith, if you have any other thoughts on that. Oh, I think you're on mute.
So as we were prepping before we started the panel discussion, we were joking about how hardware is often left out of the conversation. And this is really, it's a fascinating observation. For those that live in the hardware industry, it's hard to fathom why people don't think about this. But having spent most of my career outside of it, I get it. I mean, for most part, we just assume that it's there when we need it. And that this is just not to worry about. We're a really innovative industry, and when people need the AI infrastructure, they'll just get it. Maybe they'll get it from the cloud, and that's no problem. And it's great if that were true. But I'm really glad that your organization worked hard to make sure the industry was represented on that commission, because that is one of the key findings of the report, of course. So that's really great. And I know Andrew, you and I were also talking before. And we were talking about a different dimension of the semiconductor chip conversation. Maybe you can talk more about the RAMP program and the things that you're seeing.
Sure. Thanks. And thanks for having me on the panel today. I think the RAMP program is a really important initiative coming out of the Department of Defense to try to change the paradigm for how we drive security and assurance into all aspects of the supply chain. I think historically, we've relied on fairly obsolete techniques around physical security, which is the idea that you have to have your eyes on all aspects from design through fabrication, and that if you're constantly watching it, that on the back end, you'll end up having a secure product. But the problem with that is that it's a highly inefficient process, and it's also a process that I think inhibits the ability of the department to actually tap into the innovation that goes on around the world here. And so I'm all for the Chips for America Act. I think it's great to sort of invest in creating more capability and fabrication in this country. But in the short run, we also need to be able to take advantage of innovation and efficiency that comes from fabricators around the world. And I think what RAMP provides is a zero assurance model that uses data to really drive the analysis all the way from the design, all the way through the final fabrication, to assess whether any vulnerabilities have been introduced into that supply chain. And I do think it's an interesting combination of sort of AI and data being used to actually drive the chip design process itself. It's an interesting AI application unto itself, actually. So I'm really excited about where RAMP is going, and we're really looking forward to continuing to partner with the department as this becomes real.
That's great. That's great. Thanks, Andrew. Now, of course, the whole conversation isn't just about chips. It's great. You need hardware, but on top of that hardware, you're going to have software. On top of that software, you're going to have algorithms and data, and ultimately the human ingenuity to turn that into value for the end users. And Melissa, you're spending a lot of time in Washington with different agencies, both civilian and military. What are you seeing as far as the success so far in ramping up some of these applications?
Yeah, and this is a supercharged issue at the moment right now. And what the report kind of hit on was a lot of how we manage risk associated with AI-enabled and autonomous systems. And really, AI will enable new levels of performance for many of these systems. But the report also raises some interesting legal and ethical and strategic questions and surrounding, the topic of lethal force and providing the use of authorized by a human commander or a operator properly designed and tested AI-enabled autonomous systems. So I think there's a lot that can be talked about in how we operationalize the use of AI, whether that is the hardware, the software, the talent that needs to be considered when developing the systems, the way we deploy, and the way that we operationalize that, if it's in the DoD or if it's in more state and local type areas. The advancements that we're having right now are tremendous, and it's being leveraged by chip manufacturers and supercomputers being able to put it out a lot more rapidly. And so it's super exciting to see some of the work that we're doing and really getting to be able to get into the deep learning, deep neural net capabilities that AI has to offer. And certainly the hardware, software, and talent all have to converge in the right way in order to make it super successful.
Yeah, that convergence. Well, let's start at the top of that convergence. I think is really just basic understanding of what it is, and I want to ask each of you sort of to opine on this, because I appreciate your LinkedIn profile, Melissa. You say in your right up there in the title, AI neophyte, and I actually love that. I'll tell you why. I love the honesty of that, because here's what I like to, in the all interest of transparency. If you were to ask me back in 2015 or 2016, what my opinion of AI is, I knew more about social networks than neural networks, that's for sure. And really everything that I know really accumulated in the last 5 years, and it wasn't studying at MIT, right? It was by doing it and reading and engaging. And so the fact is, very few. There's a relatively small group of people that have been living in that world for 20 years, but the majority of us haven't. And so I think we're all neophytes. So that's why I really appreciate the comment. I think we all think we have some level of expertise on a version of AI, but the truth is we're all neophytes. And as I go around the world and I interact with government officials, and Maryam, you spend, well, most of you spend more time in DC. I spend actually a lot of time outside the US. More virtually today than anything else, but I do interact with government officials across the world, and in general, I find that there's a high degree of a lack of understanding of what it is and what it isn't, and as well as the importance of the hardware, the software, all the different sort of components, the stack of things you need to be successful. That convergence you're talking about. So AI is sort of this obscure thing. So I wanted to kind of ask each of you a version of this question. So Maryam, let's start with you, because you know Washington, you know the policymakers. In general, you don't need to point any fingers or mention any names, but just give me a sense of how would you characterize the general understanding of this topic? We want action, we want them to take action, but do they understand it?
Well, I think that's a great question. Policymakers certainly have to cover a whole waterfront of issues, many of which they may understand in detail, and many which they rely on their, scientific advisors, et cetera. So, AI, I would put in the class of what I'd call emerging or exciting technologies. I think that there are a lot of policy issues that are beginning to rise to the forefront on the AI issue. One that's really highlighted in the National Security Commission on AI's report is our leadership and competitiveness in it. And I see bipartisan concern on both sides. They may not understand the underlying technology and how it works. And I'll confess that my original major in 2002 was cognitive science, and my mom told me I'd never be able to find a job in that area. So I constantly give her grief that I could have had like a 15-year, AI career by now, but so I switched majors. But my broader point is lawmakers, they may not understand the underlying technology, but they have a strong sense of ownership that the US should be a leader in not just technology leadership, but also setting the parameters around AI. So they want to have the State Department be involved in discussions on AI ethics. They want the consumer protection agencies to be paying attention to issues related to AI data usage within the private sector. They really want the US to take that typical leadership role. And we saw that with cloud technology, and now we're seeing that sort of move over to the AI space because it has such incredible potential for solving major problems for the United States, like climate change, energy efficiency, and then, of course, all of the various national security issues that Andrew can speak to. So I think that really policymakers don't necessarily understand the underlying technology, but they understand that it has massive public policy impacts.
Yeah, that's fair. Andrew, what would you add to that?
For me, there's two examples that I really like to use to sort of bring AI to life that I think helps people understand how it's used, right? The first awakening I had was when, IBM's Watson technology won Jeopardy, right? And when you think about what it took to do that, it was really one of the first visible use cases of what AI can be in terms of massive ingestion and understanding and training of a huge amount of structured and unstructured data. And the ability to train that to be able to win that game is really sort of a phenomenal achievement, I think. But at the core were the underpinnings of what AI has become, which is the ability to take that information, digest it, come up with answers to sort of regular questions, and to be able to do that accurately and quickly. And I think one of the areas that you really see AI taking off in government is in this kind of help desk, customer service kind of process, and then also related areas around benefits administration, claims adjudication. It really lends itself well to automating what had previously been very labor-intensive processes that were very time-consuming, that created month-long lags in veterans receiving benefits, for example. Today, we're able to automate that and handle it in a day, hands-free, right? So that's one example that I think helps bring AI to life. The other, and the more recent one, is what we're doing with the Mayflower project this year, where IBM actually has created a fully autonomous ship that's going to sail from Plymouth, England to Plymouth, Massachusetts. And going to do a whole bunch of scientific projects along the way, completely hands-free. And it's a great example of sort of the state of maturity that these autonomous vehicles have gotten to. And it's a really fascinating challenge because it has to be able to digest weather, currents, all this other kind of information on the edge. And that's where AI is going, right? AI is going to how can you drive autonomous activity out on the edge, real time, hands-free. And those are two examples for me that sort of bring to life what AI is becoming and the possibilities that it creates in the government space. I think it also raises, and Melissa was talking about this earlier, a lot of really interesting ethical questions around how far are we really willing to take this, right? What boundaries do we want to put on this technology? Because it's going to be capable of doing amazing things, right? The state, if you look back 25 years and you read Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat, it's amazing to think what we didn't have 25 years ago in terms of the internet, email.
That was 25 years ago?
Smartphones, right? 25 years from now, I'm convinced that robots are going to be at a stage of maturity that we couldn't even fathom today, right? Yeah. We have an interesting set of policy questions that we have to grapple with around how do we want to harness that? Do we want to harness that? What kinds of decisions and actions don't we want AI autonomous, entities to do? Interesting set of questions, I think.
Yeah, and I'll just add to Andrew's discussion of good examples within the federal government. But one thing I'm really tracking closely and very interested in is the concept of AI for science. So, with as you all remember, with the COVID pandemic, there was just this overwhelming urgency to find therapeutics, to find out what would work to battle this disease. And what they were able to do at the Department of Energy is harness their supercomputers, which now have AI built into the edge of the chips, and create a virtual laboratory where they could test out on a molecular level what might work against COVID. And the number of experiments that they were able to do was taking like a 5 or 10 year timeline of research and compressing it into something like 2 to 3 months. So the power of AI, I think, is just incredible to solve these really tough problems that our national labs, our public-private partnerships are just very uniquely suited to try to address really big problems. And so I think we can all be very thankful that the vaccine is getting rolled out now. But I think it's a great example of where AI can be a great use cases in exploring really tough problems in science and also trying to find solutions in a timely manner.
Yeah, I got to pile onto that because I have another really profound example. One of the things that we like to brag about inside NVIDIA are where we have these situations where we've really made a meaningful. I mean, every company does. Culturally, you want to have an impact. You want to make a difference in the world, right? I mean, every company that's worth anything is purpose driven, and I know that IBM is and Deloitte is for sure. So and NVIDIA, one of the stories that we really celebrate is early on in the pandemic. We gathered up all of our best people and we worked with the Oak Ridge National Lab, one of these labs you're talking about early on, that was trying to identify some of the early targets for vaccine development. And it would normally take 12 months, or to your point, it would take 12 months to work through 1 billion compounds, to identify targets. And that actually by itself, that actually is pretty fast. I mean, 12 months, 1 billion compounds, that sounds like it's a reasonable number, but using the Summit supercomputer and which has which is the fastest computer in the United States at this time, and using some of our stuff, we were able to accelerate that from 12 months to 12 hours, and so you just think about that, 12 months to 12 hours. So you can do in less than a day what would normally take a year. And that isn't just faster, that does not cover it, right? It's not just faster. I mean, that is game changing. In fact, we like to, when we have an example like that, and we have others, but we think of that as like essentially you've turned that supercomputer into a time machine. You've enabled the scientists to do their work not just faster, but you've enabled to literally change the course of history, because you can now literally excel. And that's why we're here, where we're able to go from the identification of this infectious agent to a distribution of a vaccine, in part because of the underlying, many things contributed, but the technology played an unbelievable role this year. And I think that's a great part of the story. Now you take that idea of going from 12 months to 12 hours, and you could think of applying that just across government, to so many different things that we do, and across business for that matter, right? I mean, the transformational impact of that is hard to underestimate and underscope. So great points. Melissa, do you have anything you could pile on to that?
Yeah, I think that some of the trends that we've seen over the past year, particularly in the new environments that we're working with, we need to translate what we do into a supported digital environment. And any agency that's not digitally enabled, able to work through a digital call center or something very similar, is very much inhibited in terms of how quickly they can serve citizens' needs. And we're seeing an immense need to modernize, to move to the cloud, to help build digital capacity for particular capability they provide or mission that they are providing, and do so in as seamlessly as we would do in person. And this is a new expectation that citizens are going to be having of their governments. And it's a mixed bag of where agencies are available and able to do that right now and how we respond. I think going forward, COVID, we're going to be looking at public health as a national security item just as much as we have in the past looked at traditional warfare, and how we think about healthcare for our citizens, predict future events, and enable and coordinate our state and federal activities to support more rapid responses. And AI and the application of AI and being able to do some of that predictive analytics and what we're calling anticipatory kind of frameworks to help the government react in a better way and serve our citizens' needs is something that we're going to see continue to progress in the future. And how we help the agencies and how we help the agencies protect our citizens is going to be a huge topic for a variety of reasons.
So Melissa, let me stay with you for a moment. So obviously, we have the United States enjoys a lot of we'll call it technological leadership, for many, for generations, essentially, right? And one of the main themes of the National Security Commission of AI, of course, is this, the things that we need to do to maintain that leadership, right? And it's not just important to our national security; it's important to economic growth. It's important to a lot of things. And one of I admit, I did not read the whole report because I'm just working my way through it. It's a long report, but just in the first few pages, there was one anecdote that I thought was really well placed and really striking, and makes it very easy for anyone to understand what the challenge we're facing. And that anecdote is this: that in the 1950s, when President Eisenhower authorized a $10 billion investment in the country's future to build highways and roads, right? And we all would agree that that was a good thing. So although we're actually on the cusp of flying cars, so maybe we won't need them as much, but up to now, that's been a relatively good thing. And we look at that investment, 10 billion at the time, that was a really sizable down payment on the country's future. In today's dollars, $10 billion then is 98 billion today. So roughly 100 billion, right? So that was the kind of scale investment. And I think the overarching message is that we need to be looking at making hundreds of billions of dollars in investment today to build sort of the digital roads and highways and the infrastructure and the compute and everything we need to power what's going to be the next sort of driver of the economy. But that sounds great at the highest levels, but it comes down, what I found in my work is that it comes down to individual leaders within agencies. So yes, there's the big statements by presidents and prime ministers, and then there's the headline articles and so forth. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the leadership of those that are either appointed and into those positions, the career folks that work for them in those agencies and are to often the unsung heroes, but they're the ones that actually make it happen. So they drive this. So I'm just curious, from your perspective, what are you seeing? Are there any examples on the civilian or military side? Do you feel like we have the leadership there, to really pick up where the political statements end and the actual work has to begin? I mean, what's your feeling about that?
Yeah, I think it's still, again, a mixed bag of how people see the value, or different agencies see the value of AI, how it's developed and how it's deployed. And I think the onus is on the system integrators, the software engineers, and the hardware providers to help educate end users on why AI is so valuable within their workflow. But it's talking to the end users, it's talking to the CTOs and the CDOs of different organizations, but it's getting that top level leadership buy-in and understanding that AI might be a component to a solution, but really what we're trying to do is solve a particular problem. And educating them on, it's not going to take away jobs. It's not going to do all the bad things that are being predicted, or at least there's ways to mitigate around some of those bad things and protect how we go and serve the country and serve the citizens. I think that there are organizations within government that are across the spectrum as far as their maturity of AI and their ability to take it in right now. There's, some agencies and organizations that are 5 years behind trends. And then there's some, if you look at SOCOM and what's going on over there, they're 5 years ahead of industry trends. So you've got to take into perspective who needs it when, and meet the clients where they are, meet the organizations and the leaders where they are, and communicate the value of AI effectively.
It reminds me, as you know, Melissa, I used to be a partner at Deloitte years ago. And at the time, it just so happens that former Secretary of Health, Tommy Thompson, was also an advisor to Deloitte at the time that I was there. And I remember him telling me a specific anecdote, that when he became the Secretary of Health, he discovered that all 12 institutes within the NIH all had different email systems, and that he couldn't send an email to them all. He had to send 12. He couldn't reach them all. One of his first big tasks, as Secretary of Health, was to just put a common email system in. So we don't. It wasn't that long ago, that we're just trying to solve simple problems, right? And like sending an email to 100,000 people in one message. And now we're talking about autonomous and intelligent systems at the edge. It's a pretty big jump from email to that. So yeah, I agree. Andrew, any observations on that?
Yeah, so I think we're at an interesting point right now, which is an interesting analogy to the Eisenhower era, where agencies are finally maturing into a multi-cloud environment. They have workloads running in AWS. They have workloads running in Microsoft. They have workloads running in IBM Cloud. They have workloads running in Salesforce. They still have all of their dedicated environments. And what they're finding is to really be able to do AI at scale, you actually need a hybrid multi-cloud strategy that actually allows organizations to stitch those pieces together to do intelligent workflows. Because to really do AI and ML driven work, you often need to pull data that's resident in all those different environments, as well as sort of out on the edge on IoT devices. And so I think one of the things that I hope the government really focuses in on in coming years is how do you create the equivalent of the interstate system for a multi-cloud environment, right? Because you really do need that highway system, that hybrid cloud system that's able to do the orchestration of workloads across all those different environments, and to do so in a way that it protects the security at all those different attack surfaces. So I think there's an interesting analogy to sort of the Eisenhower era in terms of where we're going with AI. We need a highway system that enables that kind of work to happen in this new multi-cloud environment.
Yeah, well, one of the other things, we haven't talked about it directly here, but we kind of referenced it a little bit subtly, is that there is an issue, Maryam, you'll be probably more familiar with this. There is a challenge, and this is a global one. This is not unique to the US, but there is a growing concern about a thing referred to as the compute divide, which is really just the fact that that there are highways today, Andrew, but they're kind of elite highways. There's only like VIP highways, and we can stand on the corner, we can wave at people as they drive by on their high speed highways, but not everyone has access to these highways. And of course, I am largely referring to the supercomputing infrastructure in the US and elsewhere, and that is that there are elite organizations and elite, but really in the public and the private sector, that have these have this infrastructure, and then there's everybody else, and the haves and have-nots is a challenge, and it's not just a matter of prestige; it's a matter of actual sort of innovation output, the amount of research getting done. If you end up studying at a school that does not have one of these machines, then you just can't do world-class research in your field. I mean, you're just not able to do it. So there's and I think what we see globally is some countries are closing that gap faster than others. I think it's been a relatively obscure conversation. Frankly, the top 500 list, if for the most people in the world don't know what that is. I didn't know what that was until 2 years ago, to be totally honest. I didn't track, the top 500 list, but this is actually a thing that's quite important. It's been, high performance computing has been around for decades, but it has been largely entirely focused on science. And now that high performance computing is these large supercomputers are now being optimized and engineered for artificial intelligence, and they are driving them. And by the way, the picture behind me, that's Selene, which is one of NVIDIA's supercomputers. That's the 5th fastest computer on the planet. So that comes in number 5 on the top 500 list. And these machines are no longer just about science. They are driving the industrial revolution, right? The 4th industrial revolution. In fact, if you look at the list today, you'll notice that 3 of the top 10 are owned by private companies. They are industrial AI supercomputers, and the other 2, incidentally, are oil and gas companies. So, but this is a very clear trend. So the having access to those highways, building those bridges, and I completely agree with your comment of the hybrid multi-cloud. That stitching those together, and that is the platform of the future. It isn't going to be one thing. It's going to be a combination of data centers, a combination of clouds, a combination of edge, all those things, right? And mastering that distributed architecture is very complex. And building a competency in that is going to take a generation, both by not just the users, but by the consulting firms, the integrators, the hardware companies. We're all working to kind of solve that problem. But anyway, it's a great point. And we need more of those highways, and we need to address that compute. Did we lose Maryam? Because I saw that she dropped off. So hopefully she'll.
Yeah, it looks like we did. So can I just kind of
go ahead, Melissa.
go off of what you were just saying? I think that what we're talking about in the infrastructure and the way that government is starting to get get to a new steady state of how we're using AI. One of the things that I'm super excited about is the relationship that we just signed with NVIDIA, and the press release went out yesterday for the Deloitte Center for AI Computing. And we're taking advantage of the DGX superpod and the supercomputer and identifying ways that we can kind of create that infrastructure that is needed to not just deliver production capabilities, but we're also looking at being able to stand up, proofs of concepts so that governments can come in or agencies can come in and really test what's possible on some of these things. We're looking at, talking to folks in civilian sectors around digital call centers, CMS around digital call centers, connected and autonomous vehicles, advanced recommendation engines. Streaming data is really important in a lot of what we're doing right now, what we're calling data in motion. And the infrastructure, the data, the grid of connectivity that is going to be required for all of these, and the ability to leverage the compute power of a supercomputer is really going to advance a lot of these capabilities across government. And that's really exciting for what we're doing right now.
Yeah, that's really cool.
The other piece that I think is also needed in that same vein, and you start seeing places like the Joint AI Center, DoD Joint AI Center is starting to do this. I think other areas are as well, but a common AI platform and marketplace. Because what you're also seeing is people are developing sort of AI models and the like. To really be able to take advantage of that, you need a marketplace where people can develop those, put them out into the public domain, so that people who want to consume that AI model can actually apply it seamlessly into their workflow. That's another really interesting stage right now. I think it's how do we create that common platform that allows us to get the maximum leverage out of the work we do. It will rapidly accelerate time to value and significantly lower the cost of getting AI introduced into some of these core processes if we're able to drive some of that reuse through a marketplace mechanism.
Does that include like an app store type model?
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
It's sort of the app store for AI ML, because there's some wonderful models out there that have really been matured over the years, and it makes no sense just to recreate them, right? It makes sense to reuse them, and I think there's going to be a really interesting dynamic in this whole space over the next few years as that concept matures.
Yeah. And I think that within the U.S. government, hopefully that some of that's happening already. Some of that shit. That I know that there's actually a fair amount of knowledge sharing at a high level, but whether it's gotten down to the sharing at actual code level, whether there is sort of an exchange. Does that exist? Is there?
I think you see it in the Department of Defense, right? Several years ago, they created the Joint AI Center to serve as the hub for all of the AI work going on across the services in the department. And I think they are starting to get some traction in creating the mechanism within that part of government. Yeah. You don't yet see something similar on the civilian side, but there's some discussion around it, and where would be the right home? Would it be the General Services Administration, or would it be a new agency? So I don't think we've quite figured out what the right construct is on the civilian side, but I do think you'll see something like that emerge in the next 5 years.
Yeah, and Keith, I'll sort of add in.
Welcome back.
Sorry about that. Welcome to Zoom world.
Yeah.
So, one thing, the very opening letter of the commission, the National Security Commission on AI's report highlights three things: talent, hardware, and leadership. And I think, you covered the first point saying that agencies need to have leadership. The talent and hardware piece, I think, is really poorly understood. So even in the microelectronic space, the equipment needed to train the future AI engineers in all of the universities is actually quite expensive. And a lot of these programs were pretty hard hit by COVID. And so we actually just had a workshop with the National Science Foundation to talk about that. How can we make sure that our talent pool has access to the hardware that they need to be able to train and to be leaders in innovating in AI? So I think that is a really interesting concept. I also think that commercial industry as a whole needs to help drive some of these standards and innovation. So, just because it hits their bottom line businesses, the commercial industry, the private sector is much more likely to deploy AI in innovative ways. And then that ends up flowing to DoD and other government agencies as they procure, commercial off-the-shelf ICT technology. And I think we'll continue to see more of that. I was at a summit that DARPA held 2 years ago, and the CEO of Qualcomm was speaking, and he was highlighting that within the next 2 years, so about this year, they anticipated that their RF chipsets would have AI at the edge in almost 80% of their chipsets. And so I think that the private sector is leading on pulling some of these AI innovations into just commercial off-the-shelf technology. But we certainly want to see more interest on the government side on how to get these type of technologies into programs of record. And there's different approaches to doing that.
Yeah, let's stay on the theme of talent. That's a great point. I was in negotiations with a government just a few days ago on behalf of my company. I won't mention the country, but it's a smallish country, and we're discussing the possibility of opening up an R&D center there. And they were very excited. In fact, they kept pushing us to, of course, increase, hire more and more employees. No, don't make it 100, make it 200. Instead of 200, even 500 is even better. So they're trying to get some more. And then at the end of the conversation, they say, oh, by the way, it's very important that you don't poach employees from the other big companies that are here, because, that makes them upset. And I said, well, what do you expect us to do? He said, well, we encourage you to bring, kind of recruit employees to move here. I'm like, well, that's great. We certainly would try, but I think we're going to have to recruit locally to staff. And they said, well, we have a limited number of people with these skills. And so, and every time if you come into our country and you just go poach them from the other companies, then it doesn't really help us. I said, well, I think actually that's a good thing. That'll generate competition, raise salaries. I actually don't think that's bad. But, the reality is there's a limited number of people in the world with these skills in any given country. And the fact is we need more of them to support the growth. And to some degree, I think a lot of the companies are basically recruiting each other's employees. This is sort of, and especially in a small country, that's a real problem. But I absolutely agree. The talent, people don't understand the dynamics of the talent, and it's a huge gating factor on the success. You can have the best infrastructure in the world, but if you don't have the data scientists and the AI engineers and the HPC experts to work that system, then it's not going to produce a whole lot of value. And more than just the data scientists, I think it's important to understand there's a lot of other skills, non-AI skills as well, that sit on top of those, that are very important, right? It isn't just hardcore PhDs. There's a lot of other related skills. So let's just stay on that, Andrew and Melissa, just in terms of what you're seeing. Just overall in terms of commenting on not just the leadership level, but just overall talent. Do you feel like we're training? Are we making the right moves in the U.S. in Washington to take advantage of these investments?
Melissa, you want to go first, or?
Yeah, sure. In the DoD, we're starting to see a lot of conversations about this. The Defense Innovation Board was talking about this back in October of 2019. How do we create data science career paths for the DoD? GSA has been talking about that with the GSA AI Center of Excellence that they're doing through the JAKE. So we're certainly seeing that the need is there. How we can upskill some of these data scientists to be able to become, data scientists, to machine learning engineers, to, just super advanced analytics. That's going to come a lot from industry, and I think that we also need to kind of pull on the patriotic heartstrings of a lot of people to get them into the more government-focused organizations as well. But I think that we're seeing some organizations recognize the talent shortfall that we have right now, and so they're looking and reaching into industry, which is also an interesting conversation where they're talking to folks from the bigger tech companies saying, how do we work together just to pool talent in order to solve some of these bigger, hairier problems?
Yeah. For me, I think it's an area from a societal perspective that we really have to invigorate what we do in the whole STEM area from K-12 up through kind of college. We are not producing enough people who are fluent enough in sort of STEM skills to be able to meet the needs of the future. And it's going to be a problem for us as a country. It's also going to be a problem for those young people as they mature in terms of being prepared to sort of find jobs in the workforce of tomorrow. So I think our country really needs to invest heavily in trying to strengthen the STEM foundation across all parts of our education. One of the things IBM is doing is we invest very heavily in the PTech program, which is sort of a real innovative program working in sort of disadvantaged communities across the country to create a very robust high school STEM program that can then drive to create skills that make people employable in the high tech industry when they come out. So some innovative approaches in terms of how we tackle education to sort of produce the skills in the future that we're going to need. I think we really need a countrywide commitment to those kinds of programs.
Yeah. I have three teenagers at home, three Gen Zs, and I am unfortunately, and they're all in three different schools too. And I am not happy with any of the schools that they're in when it comes to this topic. I personally don't feel that we are preparing the Gen Z generation for the economy they're going into. Mm-hmm. I don't see any conversation or any skills development in their high school so their secondary education that is actually preparing them for a digital well, they're all very much digital natives, right? So they got that kind of built in, but in terms of just pure skills and even just conversations about careers, I mean, I don't think they're having any different conversations with their guidance counselors than I had 30 years ago. I mean, I feel like they're just having the same conversation. Hey, you want to be a lawyer? You want to be a doctor? You want to go to marketing? Like it's just the same conversation. So it does feel like we need a pretty big reset on that. I agree with you. Maryam, does that come up on your side too? I'm just curious if that's part of the agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. SI is very active on these workforce issues. I think there's a number of different stakeholders that are really concerned about the number of STEM grads that the U.S. is producing. We've called for doubling the number of domestic STEM graduates. We've also called for retaining. I mean, we educate a lot of foreign students who want to stay in the United States after they graduate from their undergrad STEM degree or their master's or their PhD, and we send them back home because we make it so hard for them to stay. So I think it really needs to be a 1-2 punch. We need to make sure that we are preparing children for the STEM jobs of the future. And I think a lot of our companies, including IBM in our ecosystem, are doing very innovative things like PTech. There's also First Robotics, which is sponsored by a number of players in the tech industry. But I've actually heard that many of those kids end up being more interested in mechanical engineering than electrical engineering or material science. But either way, at least they're going into the STEM fields. I think there's also some equity issues that are exacerbating this problem. So, Gen Z is the most diverse generation in US history. And there have been historical barriers to minorities in the sciences. And so, and women in the sciences. And so you're actually leaving out a huge chunk of the population if you don't address those issues. So I really think that, just an overall focus at the very lowest grade levels to get kids familiar with the math skills that you need to be successful in high school math. And our companies have highlighted that, they work with local school districts in the math skills. And the science teaching is really what restrains the pipeline. So we need to have really great math and science teachers teaching these kids, and it needs to be a big focus for the government.
There's really some really great insight on this topic. I encourage you to, if anyone in the audience, to look at the Stanford AI Index that came out yesterday or this week. They hit this of the 8 observations or conclusions that they make, the big areas. 2 of them are right on this point. One of them is on the fact that the majority of PhDs graduating from U.S. schools are foreign students. So 65% of PhDs in AI in the United States are foreign students. Now 80% of those stay in the U.S., but 20% go back, and go back home. So we do retain most of those students, but they're not U.S. born students. We're not encouraging people to go down those paths as much. And of the U.S. native sort of residents that do go into these PhD programs, Maryam, to your point, only 2.4% of them are of African American backgrounds. So very, so from that perspective, so from all the different sort of, diversity perspectives, we have a problem. So
Yeah,
I think,
and I'll just highlight, I'm not the first person to say this. The Defense Science Board actually highlighted this in an issue, and DoD has issued some RFIs on this topic. The armed forces has a very diverse, set of people involved. So I think that, people recognize if we want to be prepared for the future, we need to prepare everyone for it.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so look, that's a great topic. I don't know if I think we covered that topic. So I want to come back to one thing that we both, Maryam and Andrew, you brought up, but in the last few minutes, I do want to come back to it because it's so important. Andrew, you gave this great example of the Mayflower, and I love that example. I've read about that ship. So the edge is super important here in this conversation. One of the, we do talk about AI often like it's just a data center conversation, like that AI only happens on these really big supercomputers and data centers, or it happens in the cloud. But in fact, that's largely true today. But where it's headed is different, right? If you think about the next few years, not the next 20 years, but the next 2, 3, 5 years, the actual location of AI computing, is going to get much more distributed. And as you rightfully pointed out, Maryam, as far as the Qualcomm comment, and certainly just across the board, you're going to see the compute happen closer to the point of interaction, the point of computation, where whether that's a cash register, whether that's a car, whether that's a boat, whether it's a satellite, whatever version of the edge there is. There's many edges, of course, but that is that, and I think that's going to change the game. That does. It almost feels like we can kind of understand. We've got data centers with computers in them, but now that we're going to have trillions of devices, some of which will have quite significant compute power at the edge, it does open up a whole new world of possibilities. For example, if you think about autonomous trucks, which are already on the road and will be becoming more, a bigger part of our lives in the next few years, I mean, those are going to have a pretty powerful computer in them, And so if you've got millions of autonomous trucks sitting parked and garaged every night, you've got a pretty large distributed supercomputer, that you can tap into, when they're not being used. And the capabilities within those trucks is tremendous. The amount of AI and sensor technology is just mind blowing, right? So I do think that's going to change the equation, and we haven't. I don't think we've even begun to see that effect. Andrew, is any other big statements you just make about that?
No, I definitely agree with you in terms of the trend, and you're going to need it actually for the performance, right? You can't afford to be sending data back to home base, having the calculation done, and then send it back. As you really move forward with some of these autonomous kinds of capabilities, right? You won't be able to have the responsiveness to be able to make the decisions in real time that are needed. I think it also becomes a cheaper process. You're not paying for all the data transport. It's a more secure process at the end because you're shrinking the attack surface. So I think there's a lot of reasons why you're going to continue to see it. Some really interesting examples going on sort of with the Mars program and the space station right now in terms of stuff we're doing on the edge. When you think about those use cases, you really need to have that at the edge because you can't get that information back, earthbound, right? So I agree with you. It's definitely a rapidly accelerating trend in the industry, and I'm sure that there will be some sort of unintended consequences of it that sort of come up that we can't anticipate yet, but it's a trend that's definitely happening.
And I think governments are going to take advantage of it in a good way. Like I think this will open up a whole new data set and potentials, including incidentally, because we haven't talked about it yet, but at the city level, we've kind of mostly just stayed in scope of governments at the national level, but there's a lot of innovation at the city level as well. The biggest cities in the world that are essentially leveraging this data to inform their policy decisions and the day-to-day running of those cities and everything from urban planning to dealing with traffic optimization and that kind of thing. And none of that is possible without the edge. I mean, it's just it's all about the edge. Melissa, is there anything that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, in the smart cities kind of realm, we're seeing that with out in the city of San Diego. We're doing a lot of work there where they've been able to put some sensor devices in their lighting systems and their parking systems. So being able to capture that data and put some analytics around it is certainly something that is trending in future mobility smart cities. I'm also seeing that a lot in the DoD, and we just put a supercomputer pod on one of the MQ-9 unmanned systems, which 10 years ago, I flew and operated for the Air Force. And if we had the ability to create, shorten decision cycles and get some of that data, that actionable intelligence to the analyst and to the warfighter a lot quicker, I mean, that's a game changer. And I'm really excited to see how the UAS program starts proliferating and starts using some of this intelligence, some of the Maven 2.0 and some of the work that we're doing over at the Jake continues to proliferate with edge computing.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, that's great. And well, Melissa, Maryam, sorry, any final comments from you before we wrap it up?
I just want to thank you for participating in this panel. It's really interesting.
Well, really, I know that you're heading up to the Hill to to do some work, and we really appreciate everything you do on behalf of the industry and the country to keep us, keep the ball moving forward on policy. Andrew and Melissa, again, we're pretty much in the final few seconds. So thank you again for both joining. Really great. I know we do a lot of these panels. We're all sitting in front of our computers a lot, but I learned something today. I hope the audience did as well. I thought it was a really interesting conversation and on a really really meaty topic. If there's one takeaway, there's a lot to read, whether it's between the commission report or the AI index. There's hundreds of new reports, and they're actually pretty good and relevant today. So actually, I would encourage people to read them and circle back to any one of the panelists. I think, of course, if you have questions on the things that they're talking about. So I think with that, we'll wrap it up. I want to thank you again for joining, and we hope you have a great rest of the show.